In this video, I'm going to talk to you about a famous paper by North and Weingast called Constitutions and Commitment. This is one of the most important economics papers of all time, and easily one of the top 10, if not like top 3 economic history papers of all time. And it's certainly foundational, critical to our understanding of institutional economics. This is a really interesting and important paper because it accomplishes a few really cool things. Like, one is it chooses to examine a really high stakes story, which is the political institutions possibly underlying Britain's success. And we know that Britain was successful. We've covered that extensively. We haven't talked at all about what's going on politically in the country. But also, what's really cool here is we have a big effect. It's really important, with a great, compelling story that you can tell. And so this is why I've chosen this paper to be the subject of your first reading response. I think that it'll be really rewarding for you to be able to express the intricacies of this story, this really captivating story, in your own words. And then you can take that with you forever. So that's pretty cool. Anyway, that's my hope. North and Weingast ask a series of really big questions in this paper, starting with how governments can make credible commitments to upholding the rules that they write in order to help markets flourish. They also want to know how the winners, after a series of important political changes, got what they wanted, and what the economic effects were of creating a set of credible pro-market institutions. Our setting, as I've already mentioned, is England during the Glorious Revolution, which is a really important period for the foundations of England's political institutions. They begin their article with an interesting discussion about how governments can actually establish a credible commitment. And what they say is that there's really 2 ways to do this. So a perfectly natural place to start for a government is to try to convince markets that the government's going to do what they expect by creating a precedent of responsible behavior. For example, let's take the example of a government paying off its own debts. If that government has always paid off its own debts, that seems like a promising start to creating a credible commitment to paying off future debts. But there's also potentially another way to do this, which instead of, or in supplement to, creating a long-running reputation of paying off debts, the government could design its own rules to create constraints that don't allow it to violate its commitments. And then, as sort of an added challenge here lying in the background, making sure that the government that's able to do this doesn't create institutions within itself that become so powerful that they themselves can act without any rules. Okay, that's actually kind of a really complicated task. And especially trying to figure this out in the context of real states, the way that real states exist. So here's some additional background that kind of sets up why this is a challenging but important problem. The state is good at one thing in particular. States have a comparative advantage in coercion. They control the police and they control the army. And with those resources, if you think about it, theoretically, they could do whatever they want. But doing whatever they want all the time will not necessarily let the state get to an optimal achievement of its own goals. How, for example, can we get a state to become fiscally responsible so that it's more successful in raising money as it likes? Now, furthermore, what they establish is that reputation mechanism is not going to work for states. And the reason it's not going to work for states is the following. You can use reputation and you can make it work in a repeated game scenario under certain conditions, with certain requirements. And one of those requirements is that the future has to be sufficiently valuable. If the future is sufficiently valuable and everyone knows that the future is valuable, then reputation can sustain a pattern of good behavior because you know that the future is valuable enough for them to not want to throw that away. But states pose a particular challenge in this respect because states go to war. And when war happens, the state faces an existential threat where, well, if the state doesn't survive today, then the future has no meaning. And in those moments, the state will just burn through all of its resources. It will chuck its reputation right out the window. And all that old history may no longer matter. So we need something more powerful than just a record of past behavior to constrain the actions of a state that may face crises. So then what do we need? Well, what we need is a state that has a constitution that is self-enforcing. What has to happen is both the government and any parties that would try to do business with that government have to have incentives built into their own rules that make them abide by their own ideas ex post. That's the idea. It's got to actually be better for the government to follow the rules, and not just like 50 years from now, but like right now. That's the challenge of designing a self-enforcing constitution. So now a little bit of English history. I think the story actually tells you a lot about how this is going to work in practice. So we begin our story in 1603 when England is under the Stuarts. Okay, the Stuarts are the family who controls the monarchy in England in the early 17th century. And under this regime, the fiscal affairs of the state work as follows. The king basically manages the government like a household. This is called the king living on his own. The king did not need parliamentary consent to raise money or spend money. The king is in charge of the books. And well, what's the result of this? Well, we have in Table 1 revenue sources and expenditure levels in 1617. And the basic punchline here is that the king's revenue is not covering the king's expenditures. They are running up a deficit. The Stuarts, therefore, start to get a little desperate to raise money and make the books clear. So first thing that they do is they start to sell crown lands. This is not a good idea for a state to do, for the king to do. Selling crown lands is basically impoverishing your regime in the future. The crown lands are the bedrock of the crown's wealth. Well, they also had a few other tricks up their sleeves. I like the idea of a forced loan. You know, like I could ask one of you guys to please loan me $20, like actually loan me $20, or like I'll give you a bad grade in the class, and like maybe I'll pay you back. I mean, that's kind of a loan. It's definitely not the kind of loan I would like to make. The crown also sold monopolies, which is good for the monopoly and good for the crown, but bad for everyone else. They sold titles. This is called the dilution of the peerage, right? If you're a lord, you really don't like it if they start selling lord titles to other people. That makes your lord title less valuable. They started to outright like steal stuff, like that's called purveyance, right? Seizing goods for public purposes. They sold the right to ignore laws, and also just, you know what? They just took stuff. Okay, this is how the Stuarts decided to raise money. And you can imagine this made people pretty mad. So it gets worse. Under the Stuarts, Parliament could, they could object by issuing grievances and passing laws, but the king didn't have to obey any of these things. The king can just throw the grievances right in the garbage, doesn't have to follow the laws passed by Parliament. And the crown has several powers that formalize this. There's such a thing as royal prerogative. The king can do what the king wants. There is such a thing as the Star Chamber, which is it's a chamber, like a court above all other courts. And so if there's ever a court judgment against the king, the Star Chamber can just reverse it. But it didn't matter anyway, because actually the crown paid the judges anyway. The judges served at the crown's discretion, so if any judge would rule against the crown in a way they didn't want, they could just dismiss them. So it's a very powerful king, and a very powerless parliament. Well, okay, they did not get away with it forever. What ensues is a period of civil war, followed by the execution of Charles I, then a period known as the Interregnum, where there was no king in England, and then the restoration of the monarchy with Charles II, then James II is deposed, and then finally we have the Glorious Revolution and the crowning of William and Mary. With these changes came a lot of institutional changes along the way. So North and Weingast outlined this for us very nicely. What we end up with is not the king living on his own doing whatever he wants, but instead the king in Parliament. Parliament is then given strong budgetary power to raise taxes and decide on expenses. Furthermore, the judiciary is made independent. They no longer serve simply at the king's discretion. And also, Parliament gets a set of strong political rights like free speech in Parliament and also free elections for Parliament. This sounds great. I mean, what a set of important changes. But what makes these changes credible, that Parliament's going to have this power, especially the budget power? What's the glue that holds all this together? Well, here's a credible commitment. It's so important that they killed the king. It's so important that Parliament is able to say, look, if the king starts to misbehave and it looks like the king is overreaching and we can't pay our debts anymore, well, we've killed him once, we'll do it again. That's a really cool part of this article, right? The linchpin that holds all this together is a moment of violence. Kind of gives you the goosebumps, doesn't it? And now let's examine the effects of this. So with Parliament now having strong budgetary control and a strong commitment to repaying debts, what happens here is that the government is able subsequently to raise so much more debt than they did before, right? Take a look at the comparison between government expenditure and government debt under the Stuarts. It was minuscule compared to what we see post-Glorious Revolution, right? Where the government is spending a lot more and government debt is growing. Now, something we may discuss in section if we have time is, it's sort of odd to think of government debt as a good thing, but what government debt allows them to do is take on higher expenditure projects, and where the creditors are assured that they'll eventually get paid back. Okay, but a lot of debt is not such a great thing if it's super expensive. What's cool, of course, is that the interest rate actually goes down. This is really nice evidence that actually the credible commitment to repay debt was real, in the sense that it is evaluated that way by markets. Creditors believe they're going to get repaid. The article also tries to make a connection between what's going on the government side, like the government's outcomes in terms of raising debt, and also what's happening in the real economy. And we can discuss, I think, whether we think this is super convincing evidence. But for example, here's a cocktail napkin chart, I guess, of possible growth in the stock market. What they say is that, maybe more debt being raised by the government has positive effects on the debt markets overall in the country, and some kind of maybe positive effect on the growth of the stock market, which maybe has impacts on the Industrial Revolution as well. So, look, obviously, I love this paper. It is a beautiful paper. It's a great story and really important. But it's got some problems. Okay, here's the big problem. We know that two things happened. We know institutions changed in England, and we know that England was able to raise a lot more debt. But is this relationship causal? I think they would say so. I think they would say that the story presents a kind of causal argument. But there's not empirical support for that causation that they argue. We're going to have to dig into that a little bit more. But there's other things North and Weingast miss, actually. There's no comparative perspective at all in this paper. Actually, maybe government debt was happening this way everywhere at the time. It was. So they're missing that. but also they're missing another story of what could be happening to the rate of return. So interest rates seem to be broadly going down, and it's unclear whether that's totally just because of what's going on in English political institutions or something happening externally.